Great. Well, thank you very much, Anya, for starting the recording. And at that, we will say welcome to everyone to this Fidelis webinar. Today's session is looking to introduce you to the Transparent Trustworthy Repository Attributes Matrix, otherwise known as TTRAM. And we will give you a chance to learn a little bit more about this and to hear about how you can start to share some feedback on the ongoing development of the matrix. So my name is Joy Davidson. I'm Associate Director of the Digital Curation Center and part of the Fidelis project. And we will give you a little bit of information on the project in a minute. But before I get to that, I did want to just remind people that today's session is going to be recorded. You've probably noticed that you've had the request to accept the terms for that. So if you don't want to be on camera or have your voice recorded, feel free just to put things into the chat. We will have a shared notes document, and we'll put the link into the chat as well for you to add questions and comments there. But we do want today's session to be fairly interactive and informal. So if people do want to share comments and suggestions, you are welcome to unmute and put your camera on if you're happy to do that when we get to the Q&A and more discursive part of the session. So welcome again to the session. This is actually the second webinar we've had on the TTRAM, the matrix. This is the first public webinar that we've done. We had a session just about a month and a half ago, at the start of April, and that was with a few invited critical friends just to try and get some initial feedback on the TTRAM. And the idea is that this will be a living reference resource and something that we will continue to work on over the life of the project. But today's session is the first one that is more broadly open to get feedback from the wider community. So we are very much hoping that you will take some time after the session to take a look at the matrix and the resources, and you'll have all the links to the documents, and you'll be able to share some additional feedback in the days following today's session. So I think before I go into too much detail, I will just give you a little bit of information about the Fidelis project, just for those of you who aren't aware of who we are. We're a relatively new project. We're an infra-EOSC project, and we started just in January this year. I've been run for 3 years. We are a coordination and support action, and the main aim of Fidelis is essentially to establish a self-sustaining pan-European network of trustworthy digital repositories. So quite a lofty aim to achieve within 3 years. And as part of this work, we are very much eager to try and connect with as many people active in the community as possible. I wanted to make reference at this stage, before I go into too much about Fidelis, just to let you know that we are actually a sister project to another infra-EOSC project called EDEN. So while we are focusing mainly on the community building aspects and the support activities around the trustworthy digital repository community, EOSC EDEN is very much looking at more technical solutions and trying to advance digital preservation solutions and common standards and approaches across European repositories. So we are working very closely together with these. So I just wanted to make sure you are aware that the two projects are related and that we very often will start to work together over the next coming years. The project, so back to Fidelis. Fidelis is, as I said, a coordination and support action. We have a large number of partners, 24 across Europe and several in the UK. And many of the project partners are people who are representing the repository community, either at the national level or at thematic level. But we do have a lot of practical practitioners who are out there running trustworthy digital repository services. So the consortium is a good mix of different repository types. The main aim that we have in Fidelis, we have 3 overarching aims. The first, as I mentioned, is to set up that network of trustworthy digital repositories, primarily within the European Open Science Cloud context, but really to go beyond that as well. So what we're trying to do is primarily within the EOSC context, but we do think it goes beyond Europe and does also extend globally. The other thing that we will be doing is trying to support repositories to become and remain more trustworthy and fair enabling over time. So there will be quite a lot of efforts to foster harmonization of interoperability and to build the kind of codes of practice that people will work towards. And the final strand of the activity is really about trying to upskill people, trying to make sure that the people who work in repositories have the skills that they need to be able to keep their repositories fair enabling and trustworthy over time. So I will move on to this more complicated slide. This is basically the structure of the FIDELIS project. And this session today is really looking at Pillar 3's activity. And so you will be hearing about the TTRAM model, and this is very much part of the activity, the foundation, if you like, that we're working towards to build that common understanding of trustworthy digital repositories and to try and start to build that shared understanding of what characteristics and attributes they should have. So that's a bit about the FIDELIS project. At this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Hervé Lours from UKDF, and he will run you through the current version of the TTRAM attributes, and there will be plenty of time after that for some questions and answers, and we'll have a poll for you to take part in after that. But in the meantime, please feel free to ask questions in the chat, put it in the shared document, and we will come back to that after Hervé's presentation. So I will stop sharing and I will hand over to Hervé. I'm not sure if you're speaking, Hervé, but you might be muted if you are. We can see your slide, but we aren't able to hear you.
Hi there.
There you go.
Yeah, I shared the slides and it compacted the whole of the Zoom into a mode where you can't see the mute button.
Yeah.
That's obviously a new
Well,
feature.
we can hear you now, so that's great.
Hi, everyone. Lovely to see you. Hi, I'm Hervé Lours. As you've heard, but I'm working on the FIDELIS project. I'm also partially involved on the EDEN project as well, and we'll cover both of those at different points here today. So the Transparent Trustworthy Repository Attributes Matrix, this TTRAM, is there to provide a structure and a reference for both the FIDELIS and the EDEN projects and for the emerging FIDELIS network. It takes a bunch of activities and functions that are relatively constant across all the repositories, and it integrates how these are influenced by different repository variables. So initially, we're looking at repository type and the levels of retention, curation, and preservation that they offer. We use those to then identify what information should be made transparent. So this is all about understanding the practices undertaken by the repository through the interactions between those activities and functions and those variables as well. So we know that in some contexts, these factors will influence trust and trustworthiness in the wider research infrastructure landscape, and I'll come back to that shortly. But basically, the matrix is there as a tool. It's there to support the project, the network, and the wider EOS stakeholders as we look at collecting information in a logical and reusable way, understanding the wide variety of types and practices across different repositories, sharing structured information for consultation and use, and then designing and implementing a functional network of mutual support and aligned practice. We'll come back to this later, but basically to populate this matrix spreadsheet, you choose an activity and function that's relevant to your repository, add whatever transparent information you happen to share about it, policies, procedures, or whatever, and consider how that information and how the activities and functions are influenced by the variables, the levels of retention, curation, and preservation, and the repository type. And we'll go over both of these in a bit more detail. Based on previous feedback and internal discussions, we think it's really important to highlight that the TTRAM is not a test. It's not an assessment. It's not a network application form. It's simply a spreadsheet with examples and a supporting guide. The goal is not to complete it, and there are no wrong answers. We'll get back to the feedback options sort of towards the end here today, but we're looking for feedback through to August 15th, either as direct comments in a Google Doc version of the guide or via this email address, with a view to publishing version 1 in September and a full report in December. And this is pretty much what it looks like. Each of those here has got examples under each of the clear columns on the right there, but there's also a blank version of the template for people to fit in. So far, so good. So the key stakeholders for the Fidelis network are all the different types of trustworthy digital repositories preserving digital objects. And the small print on that is all of the words in that sentence are ambiguous, disputed, or subject to debate. So we'll go over a little bit of background, which helps explain why we've taken a particular approach to pulling together the matrix the way we have. So trustworthy digital repositories, we'll look at objects first. The D in TDR is sometimes presented as data. Sometimes data is used in a narrow and specific sense, and sometimes data is used in a broad sense to be inclusive of anything that's digital. We know that various raw and processed data of relevance to researchers or created and collected during research will be hugely significant within Fidelis. Yeah, there will be a major focus. But Fidelis is also clear that the scope of digital objects that it's looking at include, but are not limited to, software, code, ontologies, semantic artifacts, standards, schemas, and workflows. So very important that we've got that full inclusive view of digital objects. In terms of preservation, previous experience and the report and the recommendations from the EOSC Long-Term Data Preservation Task Force made it clear that preservation is interpreted as being anything from providing basic storage and integrity and access to full long-term actions to update disciplinary specific data or metadata to ensure digital objects remain technically usable and semantically understandable, fair, etc., by their expert user community. There's a huge range of interpretations. So within the matrix, what we've done is we've adopted this set of tiers, the levels of retention, curation, and preservation, initially developed and validated through the Core Trust Seal, to look at the different levels of service, ranging from retention only, with content distributed as deposited, which is basically an unattended deposit storage and access system. Deposit compliance levels, where data content and supporting metadata deposited are checked for compliance with some defined criteria, up to an initial curation service where the digital objects are curated to ensure they meet some sort of criteria. And the top tier there is active preservation, where there's long-term responsibility for ensuring that the data and the metadata can be understood and rendered as required by the designated community for reuse. So we've selected these because they allow us to drill down into the different types of transparent information that they imply across those activities and functions. And the last one here, surprisingly enough, is repository. So we've got some definitions which differentiate repositories from archives. If you look at the EOSC handbook, they differentiate repositories from databases, though the described features in the text make them look pretty closely aligned. The term repository could appear to exclude registries because the latter are holding metadata rather than data records. Yeah? So we know that there's a variety of interpretations here. Within the context of the project, we're just treating all of these as potential venues where a human being might interact with digital objects. Yeah, so this could include everything up to EOSC nodes as well. The term venues taken from the Scientific Knowledge Graph interoperability framework, which is coming out of OS Trails at the moment. But essentially, it just means that anyone who is an organization which is responsible for a catalog listing digital objects can be modeled by looking at this, because it's all about the levels of responsibility taken. And then finally, trust and trust context, which is something we'll be working a lot more on as we gather feedback here and then take this out more broadly. So the EC annotated grant agreement sets specific expectations for deliverables and outputs of funded projects. The EOSC handbook provides requirements for engagement with EOSC nodes. And then trust certification standards, including things like the Core Trust Seal, currently only apply to active preservation repositories. So that's just 3 examples. They've all got widely different requirements and expectations of what information should be made transparent to demonstrate trustworthiness. In addition to that, something like the CESDA, Eric, of social science archives, or the Elixir core data resources, like in repositories involved with them may need to follow additional and more specialist expectations. I mean, overall, this just demonstrates that trustworthiness is not a single binary outcome of a standard assessment. But that means that the matrix must be pretty flexible enough to adopt new variables and address different trust contexts over time. So defining a model for those trust contexts is going to be a significant part of the future work of the project. So back to those activities and functions. This rather busy diagram gives you an overview of what's there. They're divided up into, they start off by asking for a little bit of context about each organization, and then are divided into digital object management, organizational infrastructure, technology, and security. The activities and functions, they're a superset. They're drawn from a range of existing criteria, guidelines, requirements, and standards that we pulled together. And then the matrix is there to support cooperation and alignment between a lot of these. So the intention is to complement and engage with those working to develop more specific and granular criteria. It's not intended to dilute or replace them. This is not yet another assessment system, as I've said. This literally is a common thread across a wide range of requirements that are out there at the moment. The diagram you see in there is the digital object management activities and functions, including kind of like a fairly familiar life cycle from conception through to reuse of digital objects. And the template that you'll see shows you the group, the activity and function itself, and provides a very brief scoping definition. So these items have been pulled together from a much larger list of activities and functions, including the Coalition of Open Access Repositories, various pieces of work around the Core Trust Seal, federally funded research repositories in the States, work from the Digital Library Federation, DPC RAM, FAIR's FAIR, the Elixir Core Data Resources, the NDSA Levels of Preservation, NIH, the FAIR Principles, the Trust Principles. They've all been used to look at some of these, and we've already done some work sort of in the background to then map some of this out into things like the repository criteria put into re3 data or FAIR sharing. So there are multiple sources to reach this point. And for each of them, we know that we can't really do anything about anything without transparent information. So there are brief descriptions of what you might share and examples of what you might share based on either feedback that we've received early in the project or existing resources or supporting guidance for those criteria. If you're filling this in, you can be as general as you want in terms of what you think you might use or what information you might share. But generally, this is going to break down into information artifacts, which might be internal, like policies and procedures, or external references like guidance, criteria, and legislation. Or it might be more specific repository characteristics. So the standardized repository information from the Data Repository Attributes Working Group, they release the draw criteria, or metadata in a re3 data repository registry. Or the levels of retention curation themselves might be included in that. One of the pieces that we'll end up working on a little bit further in the future is how also this information implies specific object characteristics. So something about an object that results from a repository's activity or function. So under rights, this could be the specific deposit and reuse license for an object. In the case of the activity and function on storage integrity, the outcome for an object might be a specific checksum, for instance. So it's drawing from the activities of the repository and then moving into what that implies for the specific characteristics at the object level. And you'll see that all of this is moving from, I guess, from the prose to the more granular. And that means we're moving from the potentially less machine actionable to more machine actionable, which will be another underlying theme of the work we do over the course of the next 2.5 years. So that's what you'll get for each of these. You identify your group, your activity function, your description, and transparent information with examples. But we know that transparent information about that activity and function is influenced by a number of different variables. Now, we started off by selecting 2, which are critical to that small print item that I raised earlier. The first is the levels of retention, curation, and preservation, which takes us past varied definitions of preservation itself. And the second is the commonly used types of repository that influence the scope of the collections and the organizations that care for them. Now, we looked at the levels of retention, curation, and preservation earlier. This provides a slightly different viewpoint on those in terms of a repository typology, ranging from a pure retention-only repository to stacking up, setting criteria at the point of deposit, undertaking to do initial curation work, and then doing active preservation. And many active preservation repositories will, of course, undertake initial curation and deposit compliance, and they all essentially depend on effective underlying guarantees of retention. Now, we looked at the types of repository, the internal early adopter view that we had of this matrix gave us some really useful feedback. The commonly referred to repository types include institutional, regional, national, international, and then we look at generalist versus disciplinary or domain or specialist repositories as well. These are all terms which are well used and will continue to be well used by a wide variety of people, but based on our analysis and the feedback that we got, they don't really tell you everything that you need to know about those repositories. So when we're looking at this variable, we're really focusing on how those different repository types influence the objects, the depositors, or the users' characteristics that could lead to them being either included or excluded from a particular repository. So this could be depositors that are accepted or rejected based on their institutional affiliation. Users which might be accepted or rejected at the point of access based on their geographic location, or the different digital object types and content that might be accepted or rejected for deposit, curation, preservation, and access, potentially based on whether you're a disciplinary or a domain repository. You might have a more limited list you'd accept. So we're really looking at that variable in terms of how it influences the repository activities and functions, and then the related transparent information that we're looking at there. As we've said, the only reference point that we can really work through to support each other on this network is the stuff that's made available publicly and is made visible and transparent to others, but also improving that information and supporting each other to simplify the sharing of that information is a major goal of the work that we'll be doing. So these initial variables have been selected as a foundation. So whether your level of curation influences the technical monitoring you've got to do with formats and software, monitoring your community needs, or identifying triggers for preservation actions, that's going to change the information that you share. So that repository type restriction, and this was one of the major bits of feedback that we had from the first iteration, those restrictions on depositors, collections, and users influence whether a researcher should or could select that repository for their research outputs, either to put them in or get them out. And being able to answer that question seems like a pretty good baseline for the metadata and information that should be available about a repository. So variables influence the activities and functions and the associated transparent information. Going back to that small print, it's all about understanding these key variables and how they interact. Yeah, and they'll provide the foundation for a common vision and for the exploration of additional relevant variables over time. So these include, but aren't limited to, the fair, care, and trust principles, which there's already emerging work on these and how they're associated with the matrix. But possibly the biggest part of this and the biggest challenge to model over time is the trust and trustworthiness piece. So we've said before that trust is not a binary or a static outcome of a single one-size-fits-all assessment. So defining trustworthiness in a really meaningful way means defining the contexts, yeah, and that depends on understanding the objects, the actors, the roles, and the expected level of service. So these in turn make it clear that an assessment of trustworthiness needs to be based on reliable, transparent information. So this information, as well as a tool for interchange between repositories and a network, is potential evidence for some type of assessment. But we've prepared a design statement for the matrix, which will hopefully be published if I can get a response from Zenodo on my support. The design statement prepared for the matrix takes account of a range of those influences. Yeah. So it includes the past and the current EOS task forces, the long-term preservation task force, the long-term retention task force is ongoing at the moment. Obviously, retention is what sits underneath all of those levels of retention, curation, and preservation. As we've mentioned, we've got the European Commission and their Horizon Europe annotated model grant agreement, which this project and everybody else in this space needs to follow. So all of those things and the EOS handbook provide a perspective on the essential criteria for trust, but they all employ slightly different perspectives with slightly different terminology and slightly different purposes. So modeling that is going to be a really big deal over the next little while. We need to make sure that we have multiple authorities for this information, but we're very transparent ourselves about what the implications are for repositories and what the scope and context is for trust, what the outcomes are. And we've got a bunch of other dependencies and interdependencies to think through here as well. Yeah. So the matrix will support and or seek to align with network governance and value-added work in FIDELIS, FIDELIS's training and support, and their strategic alliance work, and the various cascading grants, communications, and disseminations that will be out there. So we're looking at using the matrix as a common thread and a connection point to a range of different interests, and different specialities, and a set of different criteria just from within FIDELIS. But on the sister project on EDEN, we'll be looking at aspects of the expert and community engagement, the data and process framework for long-term digital preservation, the discipline-specific requirements for validation and future use, and the long-term access and preservation services and tools. There's also ongoing work with a related set of data venues, which is the Research Data Alliance work on technical repository service providers, looking at, again, a similar set of criteria which we hope to fold into this superset of matrix activities and functions. And this is where the dependencies and interdependencies mean that we do need to be extremely flexible and that we can't be too prescriptive about a lot of this. The EDEN outputs on preservation, reappraisal, and quality criteria can all be integrated into the matrix at a more granular level where they're relevant. This will be specifically around active long-term preservation repositories and disciplinary repositories and technical services. But we also know that a lot of those things which will emerge from EDEN, understanding format challenges, updating ontologies, engaging with your user community will be much more broadly applicable to a wide range of FIDELIS stakeholders. And the matrix will also support ongoing alignment with existing standards, guidelines, criteria, and metadata. So what we've done to start off with this was we've developed a superset of items for the matrix. But now we're in a position to go back and speak to those various criteria authors and developers and certification bodies and build clearer mappings that have been signed off by them between the matrix and their own areas of work, and then drill down further into having an agreement, for instance, on what idealized evidence might look like, if that's an assessment. We're particularly interested in this at the UK Data Service because we've got multiple sets of compliance criteria. We're Core Trust Seal, but we're also ISO 27001 for information security. We have to follow the UK's Digital Economy Act. So we're very interested in making sure that the wide range of evidence that we have to complete and maintain over time for these different criteria can be managed in a really efficient and reusable way. So that if there's any additional expectation, it doesn't put too much additional pressure on the organization as a whole. So we're very much active stakeholders in all of this. So back to the matrix itself. As we've said, all you need to do is work your way through the items which will be linked into the chat and elsewhere. Choose something that's relevant to your repository. Yeah, the vast majority of things will be. And and type in whatever transparent information you share about it. Yeah. So what policies, procedures, and metadata have you got? And then think about how they're influenced by the variables. Yeah. So we've got what level of retention, curation, and preservation do you do? How does that implement? How does that influence what you do? And the repository type, how does that influence which depositors you serve, which users you serve, and which objects you include or exclude from your collections? These are the first degree of granularity beyond a simple repository type statement or a simple statement of preservation that we need to get to mutually understand each other, and to be able to sort of design this network and support each other. Because the point of this network is that we reach a common understanding and we've got a common voice for all of the repositories out there. So based on some of the feedback we've got, I'm going to reiterate this as well. This is not an assessment or a test. There are plenty of other assessments out there. The activities of the network itself might help us to be more specific about what those assessments expect and what idealized evidence might be for them. And then we can do my favorite thing, which is cheat off each other to copy templates and information so we can all pass these assessments more easily. There's no underlying test for all of this. Nobody is pointing at your repository or your digital objects to assess them through the matrix itself. But object tests for FAIR and repository assessment information, they are ongoing and active things. They are also a candidate for cooperation through FIDELIS to see how we can best respond to that testing and succeed against it. But that means that in this context, there are no wrong answers or judgments. Yeah, this is all about mutual understanding. This is all about information sharing. It is not a judgmental situation. So you don't have to, I think there's 30 items in total, including the context is here. The goal is not to complete it. There is no prize at the end. And you don't have to fill in the whole thing. Yeah, a gap is just a gap. If no information is available, that's fine. Now, we think that most of these activities and functions will be broadly applicable. Absolutely everything that is in there because some fairly high profile and well-respected set of criteria or standards says that something like that should be shared to demonstrate trustworthiness, good practice, or whatever the headline might be of the standard itself. But some of them may not apply to you or your organization. We've tried to fill in a template in a way that says not applicable when we don't think something will be applicable, certainly in terms of the variables. But some of them may not apply to you. Yeah, or some of them might be handled by a third party, and looking at what's handled by third parties versus the local organization will be another area that we'll look at over time in the network, because we're all increasingly codependent and interdependent. That's why we're looking at the Trustworthy repository service provider stuff from RDA as well, because we know that they're providing key underlying services, which many of us share. So this is all about coming up with something that's as simple as humanly possible to take one step forwards in mutual understanding and cooperation. Yeah. Now you can take away the matrix. We have, and a number of other people on the project have as well. And you can fill it in for yourself. Yeah. Now, what we did at the UK Data Service, we're going through our Core Trust Seal renewal at the moment. The matrix maps very closely to Core Trust Seal, as you kind of expect from this kind of thing. So we can start off with that. We'll be looking at our other information artifacts that we've got for different sets of digital economy access criteria or ISO 27001, and we'll be mapping those into the matrix and using those activities and functions to drive kind of internal discussions about what we do now, what we might share in the future, or what external references we might use. Corollary to that for us, and this is something I mentioned briefly earlier, is that we will be looking at how we move from prose to more explicit expressions of things as metadata or expressed through APIs. Increased machine actionability is one of the things we're looking to use the matrix for, identifying what we've got as prose information, identifying what we could better share more openly as machine actionable information in one way or another. So for us, this has got a definite immediate benefit. Yeah. So we'll be using those concepts and the terminology and the diagrams to kind of like, start conversations internally to manage some of that internal information. And then we, along with a bunch of others, will provide feedback, and we'll talk about feedback in a moment. But it's perfectly possible to use this internally. It's perfectly possible to not engage with this any further elsewhere. It is a useful tool for thinking this through. But if we can get some feedback from people, or some completed or some populated versions of this matrix, it takes us this one step further that we need to get beyond common repository types and slightly muddled definitions of preservation to think about what the actual levels of service are and what the impact on users and depositors and objects is of the different repositories. That's that one step forward in mutual understanding. And once we've got that, we can start to drill down into some of those other concepts, such as what this means for enabling fair data, or enabling the trust principles or the care principles themselves. We'll have enough granularity of detail for that model to do that. And then eventually we can look at that and map it across to this authority model that we need to think about in terms of defining different trust concepts. So I've got to look after certain bits of information for the benefit of information security, other bits for the benefit of the UK government. I have to show certain criteria as we're members of the CESDET ERIC. We've got different evidence sets for core trust seal. All of these things start to line up. And then we can use that information to say, well, look, how does this enable something like, demonstrating that we make data fair, or demonstrating to the European Commission that our project outputs are trustworthy, or to the EOSC Association that we are an acceptable body to be involved in an EOSC node, for instance. So all of these things kind of cascade out of this beginning layer of granularity and mutual understanding. So any information a repository shares is useful to validate the matrix, understand repositories, and guide future network activities. And that last one's pretty critical as well. There's a period of feedback, which we've left as long as possible, given our deadlines, to enable hopefully those who are taking summer vacations to have an opportunity to feedback and come back to us. There's an email address there. All this will be shared in addition as well. And there's also a Google Doc version of the guide. So the template information is all reproduced in the guide, each of the activities and functions, each of the descriptions, each of the variable examples, so that people can provide feedback and input directly into that if they want in suggest mode, or they can drop us a line via that rather lengthy email address now I look at it. So we'll have feedback up to August 15th. Version 1 will be published in September, and then a report in December. There'll be additional workshops around this as well, including explanations of the things we'll be building on this in years 2 and 3 of the projects, and the things that we'll be integrating from projects like EDEN, but also interactions with sort of the EOSC and others on how we might model their expectations of trust. So what are we looking for? We're looking for any gaps or clarifications in those activities and functions and the descriptions that we've got. We know that there's at least 15, 16, 17 and growing other criteria out there that go into all of these in vastly more detail. So we're not looking for 10,000 words per activity and function. We want to make sure that the descriptions and scope are clear. We're really looking for good examples of documents or metadata related to that activity or function that your organization either provides or uses. That's that transparent input to this network. It becomes a resource for us all to share over time. We're looking at gaps and clarification of the levels of retention, curation, and preservation. Yeah. So we've got very good experiences with this so far through multiple iterations. But the core trust seal itself is looking at including those in future versions of the core trust seal. So one of our goals after August 15th will be to support a Fidelis project response into that core trust seal revision process related to the levels of retention, curation, and preservation. I think our experience so far is that they really do take you a step further than yet another definition of terms. And they do effectively cover a very wide range of different repository levels of service. But we want to hear back from you about that to allow us to give a more coherent response into the core trust seal themselves. We've already talked about the fact that we need to go from repository labels, those common repository types, down to thinking about what that means at the depository user and object level. So we're looking for any additional object, depositor, or user characteristics that would help us understand repository types. We know that we're going to have a much wider range of feedback from a much broader group of service providers now. So we're looking at how we sort of drill down from what we've got to a really effective model. Getting those levels right and getting these types right really is the foundation for them looking into more in-depth areas of kind of repository practice afterwards. And we're looking for alignments between the matrix and existing standards and criteria. Yeah, so are you working or do you follow a particular set of standards or criteria? Should we be looking at other criteria to align with over time? It hasn't yet been decided how we produce this to make it, everybody wants the world's largest spreadsheet to look at. But if we can work out a way to drill down some of these mappings and bring them out, then there really is the possibility of kind of alignment between multiple existing standards and criteria, which I think would benefit those criteria and would certainly benefit us as a repository organization in understanding what the expectations are. And as you go through all of this stuff as well, have a look at any related areas of focus that the Fidelis network should take forward. We've been through some of the activities that the network will undertake over time. But obviously, we're really looking for network potential members and future members to look at where their priorities are. And not everyone will have those same priorities. And we will have to devote our resources to specific areas of focus. So very happy to hear suggestions of those, particularly if they're related to a particular activity or function, a particular repository type, or a particular level of retention, curation, and preservation. And then this leads us into sort of future planning on what events we could hold, what activities we could undertake, or what user groups we need to bring together over time. So that really is all from me. The matrix tries to be one step forwards to allow us to collate information for mutual understanding so that you can use it in a local environment. And then with the information you share, we can bring together a cooperative network, which really does understand its members and their goals. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Harvey. That was a really good overview of the work done to date and the rationale behind it. And I think it's really worth repeating that this is a superset of attributes. It's not replacing anything that exists already, but it's trying to harmonize between them and make sure that you can find something useful. And I do think another thing that I took away from this is that using TTRAM is useful regardless of whether you're going for certification. It's a useful activity for any repository just to run through, and it doesn't have to be a precursor to anything like going for core trust seal. It is just a good activity in its own right. So that is definitely worth repeating. And I think, again, your point about the fact that all of these things don't live in isolation. So you're looking at your repository for a number of different reasons, you know, data security, trustworthiness, and all various different sets of criteria. And hopefully having this superset, as you mentioned before, doing this activity does take time and effort and money. So hopefully going through this will be useful, not just for one purpose, but for many. So that is, I think, also useful to bring forward. We did have quite a few questions coming through in the chat. So I'm going to just share my screen and we can go to the shared notes and try to run through as many of these as we can. The first one, I think, was just to make you aware or to ask a question about a study on the readiness of research data literature repositories to facilitate compliance with the Open Science Horizon Europe model grant agreement requirements. And I think it was just to make sure that we're aware of this. And I believe the response from Marie says that we are. So hopefully there's nothing more to be said there, but if anybody has anything they still want to ask, let me know. Second question was from Christophe Bruch, and he was asking, does it make sense to report information which is already available, for example, in RE3 data?
Yeah, I'm going to be careful about the word report here. Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a context section at the beginning of this. Yeah. If you put in your re3 data record, that will indicate that you're using re3 data. Yeah. But as I said, it's not a test or anything. Mapping the matrix and the activities and functions out to re3 data is something which has already been done in draft, and we'll speak to re3 data about that as well. Yeah. But yeah, this is not about, I will reiterate, but this is not about collating huge amounts of redundant information. If you've got good local practice and you consider that practice is sharing via re3 data, then popping a re3 data record into the context would be an excellent example. And you can assume that at our end, we will get it.
Okay, perfect. Just add that into the notes. Great. A second question here was asking from Roxanne Wins, what if you are already Core Trust Seal certified? Does completing the matrix bring any additional benefit or transparency?
The alignment with Core Trust Seal is pretty good. I mean, the alignment with all of those other sets of criteria is pretty good as well, but it is a subset. It is a superset, as we've said. There are 16 Core Trust Seal requirements, and there's like, you know, nearly as many, again, other items that people have got. So one of the discussions we had was about overlap. So there's something on workflows, which is all about the high level of workflow management, despite the fact that any one of those activities or functions might be supported by a workflow. As I said, it's not a test. You don't have to type this in 12 times. But there are areas of, for instance, workflow management that you might think about. That aligns closely with Core Trust Seal. Yeah. But Core Trust Seal doesn't ask you about access because they just assume that giving access is an inevitable part of your role as a trustworthy digital repository. But many other sets of criteria set specific expectations on access. So that's an example where something which is not currently covered by Core Trust Seal is covered in addition within the matrix. So yeah, and we know that a bunch of these will line up with things that we're doing at the UK Data Service, which aren't covered by Core Trust Seal because it doesn't see them as essential to TDR status, but are still pretty important to us as a repository. So I think yes, is a simple answer.
Yeah, and I would say the other kind of useful activity is that the emphasis on TTRAM is not just whether you have the information somewhere, but that it is transparent. So I think it is forcing you to think through what information you have and how you share it and make it more visible. So I think that's a useful step in its own right. Okay. Another question in the, I'll go through the ones in the notes and then I'll jump back to the chat. So while it's clear that TTRAM is not, how might a repository actually exploit it for its own purposes? Could you provide any specific use cases? And I think you kind of mentioned a little bit before about some of the things UKDS is currently looking to assess itself against, but maybe you can run through it a little bit again.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Cool. Examples. So we will be going out to Core Trust Seal to say, hey, look, are you happy with the mappings between the matrix and Core Trust Seal? And by the way, here's a whole bunch of different evidence that people put forward. Can we be a bit more specific about what the minimum viable evidence for Core Trust Seal would be? Yeah. We will probably go back to re3 data and say, well, you know, it's great to say you're an institutional repository. Is there some metadata that we could come together and provide that will be a bit more specific, that would allow a depositor to ask and answer the question, as me, can I put this object in that repository? Yeah, which I don't think we can do yet. So that would be a huge thing. We're also looking at what our existing evidence is across the board and what we've already got. Could we go and do an ISO? Could we go and do another certification based on the evidence that we've already got? So sort of gap analyses would be there. And the other one that's been worked on in things like the FAIR project and FAIR impact is mapping these expectations to something like FAIR enabling. Yeah, which activities and functions do I undertake influence the FAIR outcomes for digital objects? So that's another thing that we'd use it for. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of them. I think the second year of the project will then be looking at maturity. Yeah, and so that will be another area where you look at those different activities and functions and say, I think not so much because everyone have a different perspective on maturity from different trust contexts. Everyone's got different contexts, as we've discussed, so we need to model that. But in terms of maturity, we're probably looking at how do we move this information from inside people's heads and reduce risk and improve performance to the organization by moving it into kind of a managed information environment. And then eventually, how do we share it more transparently? And we know that one of the key things that we do on CESDA is try and share good practices so we can cheat off each other. Yeah, which is one of our major goals. So I think there's a whole bunch of things that we can do with this once we've got the validation through on this particular feedback round.
So right now we're really looking to get the reference levels correct and then move forward from the stable version into the levels of maturity. So yeah, that sounds good. I think the next question is sort of related to the previous one, and it was just asking whether the TTRAM is mainly designed as being an internally facing tool or a process, or is it something that you would use as a network facing document, something to provide that evidence more externally to potential end users or various other stakeholders who might be interested?
Yeah, I mean,
in that case, if it was the second case, how do you handle the linked proof and information in a way that can be shared?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to get to the point that we've discussed this on different bits of work on FAIR impact. I'd like to get to the point that I don't have to type my information into 30 different locations every time, or correct a bunch of information that's been scraped from the internet about my organization. So yes, machine actionable, transparent information exposure is part of this, but just testing to see if someone's got a URL to a Word doc that claims to have the word preservation in the title doesn't guarantee the level of service that someone's getting. Yeah, so that's part of this discussion about moving from prose to machine actionability. In terms of sensitivity, I think if you accidentally share sensitive business information during the course of this feedback process, then you've got bigger problems than the matrix. So don't, obviously. Sensitive information sharing has come up on things like the Core Trust Seal before as well. Yeah, so you can share information privately with Core Trust Seal to demonstrate your practices, but I think it's perfectly possible to share your approach without sharing things which increase the attack surface of your organization. Yeah, in the same way, I think it's perfectly possible to share your mission and goals of your organization without accidentally sharing commercially sensitive information. But sometimes, it's difficult. If it's all in a wiki and that includes a bunch of passwords, then maybe don't give us the password to the wiki.
Okay, great. I think the next point was really just a recommendation. It was from Mickey Lindar, just saying that the FIDELIS TTRAMatrix version 00.02 template that you've added to Zenodo, it would be great if you could share it with the Zenodo digital preservation community. So that's something that we can take on board after.
Yes, definitely will do.
Great. Question from Robin Rice. I'm just asking, you had suggested that we're looking for people to complete and populate the matrix. And she asks whether there is any potential to kind of reuse some of the information provided in the survey, which was quite detailed. So is that something that we could maybe explore?
Yeah. maybe I can take this. So, hi everybody, I'm Mari Klemola from the Finnish Social Science Data Archive and leading work package 5 in Fidelis. So really, yes, first, thank you for responding and thank you for everybody who has responded and used their time. Yeah, the survey was constructed so that it addressed the activities and functions, and we are actually in the forthcoming report looking at these responses by these activities and functions. So we have not planned to populate the matrix based on the survey. I don't think there's actually enough details, for example, linked documents or so on, but we will look at the survey responses and take that also as a feedback or as a contribution input to the next version of the matrix. That is due in September, as Herve already mentioned. So
thanks very much, Marie. Yeah, an excellent suggestion on data reuse. We'll see what we can do. Next question was from Mickey Lindar, and she is asking a little bit for some clarification. So when we talk about registries as a system just holding metadata, is that within the scope of what Fidelis would describe as a repository? So I see, Hervé, you're already typing. No, you would not define a repository. So
no, I don't. We will not spend the next 3 years coming up with another definition of repository or archive or anything else. So, I mean, the term I used in there, which is from the scientific knowledge graph folks, is just a venue. Anything, and they're using the term from a particular RDF vocabulary, which I can't remember at the moment. Just anywhere where you might interact with a digital object. Imagine yourself as a person accessing. Essentially, we're all here to service reuse at one level or another. If I am interacting within an environment, any venue which has got a digital object in it, and if I'm a registry, then my digital objects are metadata records. It's not, it's not too hard to see the similarities between those two scenarios. I want to know what your digital objects are, and I want to know how you're looking after them. Yeah. And I think that can be very, very inclusive of potential future members of the FIDELIS network without having necessarily to say, we're going to call this a repository or that a repository. It's just a question of highlighting that if you're an organization with a catalog of digital objects of any kind, then you're a potential venue for interacting with those digital objects, and therefore you're a potential stakeholder in the future FIDELIS network.
Right, well, that leads us on very nicely to the next question, which is from Roxanne, and is asking to be part of the FIDELIS network, will completion of TTRAM be required?
God, I hope not.
Quite a bit of
no, I hope not. I hope not. No, this is
yes.
Yeah, I mean, this is. So I think I said before, this is not. I don't know what questions people will ask for the future of this evolving network. Yeah, I do know that I can go and if I share this information bilaterally with another organization, that we will have jumped ahead in terms of our ability to cooperate and interoperate on something. But no, this is not the world's largest form. It's not even there where we're saying we want everybody here to try and fill all of this in and respond. Tell us whether you think it's useful. Yeah. If you've got a cracking example of something which we should all copy, then tell us that, because that would be amazing. And that's what I hope most of this network will help me do, is jump from zero to best practice with as little thinking and effort as possible. That would be a successful FIDELIS network for me. But if you've already got CTS, yeah, you've already got most of this covered, I would have thought.
Yeah, and I believe the only requirements to be part of the network at this point of the project is to endorse the trust principles. I believe that's the only kind of formal requirement.
Yeah.
So
I'm just jumping here. So I added a link in the chat. If you are interested in joining the network as a provisional members, go there and look at that information. And there will also be a network webinar. It will be announced soon. I think it will be on 1st of July. But this is also, everything is work in progress when it comes to network membership as well. So this is also your chance to have your say on what the network, what you think the network should look like. And So please join. That's in short.
And there's a related question from Robin asking if the project succeeds in building the network, how will it be sustained after the project? And I think the key thing to say here is that we are very aware of this, and it is something that's being considered from the outset of the project. So they will be working on this with the community in the network to try and find the most sustainable way forward. But, yeah, it's always a challenge.
Yeah, and it's always also a chicken and egg situation in terms of, I mean, you know, what do people expect this network to do? That will impact what it needs to do to be sustainable. If you want to run through the activities and functions and just email that feedback email and say, these are the top 5 things which are lacking in community support, that would be an amazing thing to have as well. Yeah. All of that kind of granular feedback on how you might use it and how it might inform your work, or how it might inform what you'd want from a network, is vastly more important than trying to laboriously work your way through sharing every single detail of the information you've got. Yeah, much more interested in the model and the approach than we are in that granularity. Though if you've got a good example of a policy or a procedure that I can cheat off, again, I am very happy to see that as well.
Okay. Yep, I see that there. I think we've addressed all of the questions now in the document and in the chat. And just to say, Marie, thank you for putting the link into the chat about the network. So if people are interested and missed the webinar, you can go and watch the recording, and you'll find out the current requirements for getting involved. So last chance, if anybody has anything else that they would like to ask Hervé or any questions. No, okay. Well, what I'd like to do now is to move on to a quick poll, because we'd like to hear from you now. We just have a couple of quick poll questions. So people can go to menti.com and enter the code 12293956. And my colleague Anya, I think, will put that in the chat as well. I will just share the screen again. Use this. So we have been discussing about trust and the definitions of trust and trustworthiness. And Hervé mentioned a few definitions in the slides, but did mention that it is quite subject specific, and it's up to the eye of the beholder what trust means. So we'd just like to hear from you, in your context, what does trust mean in your opinion? What are trust factors? So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to add things. So you're seeing things about data quality, documentation, transparency, evidence, transparency again, governance, open documentation, user community adoption. I think that's definitely a good factor to keep in there. Sustainability, clear sources of evidence. Again, we're seeing the designated communities. So again, if you're used and trusted by somebody, then hopefully that's a good endorsement in its own right. Evidence, and again, as we define the matrix and come up with these more granular levels of what could be considered sources of evidence, and hopefully the more people share about what they provide as evidence, we can come up with some guidance on that. That is definitely something we'll have to take on board. And data quality, very tricky as well. The curation services, what does the repository provide? And again, yes, I think you have to be very transparent about these things, especially as funders are requiring people to make use of trustworthy repositories. The more we can make clear what services we do offer, I think the easier it is for the end users to navigate them. Longevity, transparency, stability, availability, that's again good. I think we want to be able to access things. Publicly available self-commitments, that's interesting. So I guess, again, just assertions that you want to do a good job and are clear about how you're going to do that. So that seems to have slowed down a little bit. Okay, well, I think we've got some useful information there. I think they align with some of the definitions we already have, but again, we might come back here and see if there's anything that we could pick out that we haven't already got. So I'm going to move on to the next question. Oops, sorry. Which is not allowing. So the next question that we wanted to ask was, we haven't looked at all of the 30 elements in the matrix, but I think you got a fairly good idea of some of the things that were covered. And we just wanted to get a sense from you at the moment. Are you able to provide information? Again, we know you haven't seen all of them in detail, but just based on your own kind of gut feeling, do you think you're covering some? Do you think you have most of them covered? Few, none, or other? And for those who are putting other, it would be interesting if you want to stick in the chat what other means. That would be great. But at least from what we're seeing now, it seems like most people could provide information against at least some of the elements. Okay, so thank you. Or Robin, I think other means for you. I don't know. I think that's a fairly legitimate response. We'll add that into future feedback sessions. But for now, it does seem like at least most people think that they have something. So there would be something to add to the matrix. So again, we would be very grateful if people who do have any information that they can share against elements in the matrix, if you could take a few minutes. You wouldn't have to complete the whole thing, but as Hervé said, anything that you can share would be gratefully accepted by us and useful for the further iteration of the model. So I think it's slowed down a little bit, so I will try to go on to the next one. So the next one is, again, sorry for the typo here. I've added 3 R's to currently. But so you can, most people said that they can provide information. The next question is about whether you're currently making that information transparent. So again, we've got options, yes, no, partly, and not sure. And I think we're seeing here kind of more coming up on the partly. So again, quite a lot of you are already doing this, which is great. And again, if you are already doing this, we would love to know how you're doing it. So again, as Hervé said, we can share this kind of evidence and good practice and let other people copy you. So feel free to let us know how you're doing it. The partly one, again, we'd be interested to know, what you're struggling with, and perhaps part of the activities of the network going forward could be thinking about how we can make some of this a little bit easier to do where we're finding challenges. So again, I see it's slowing down a little bit, but pretty positive to see that at the moment we are a group full of people who are finding it more or less straightforward to make some of this information transparent. The question that Hervé mentioned before, we're obviously trying to progress this work very much not to replace what's already out there, but to build on it and to create that superset of criteria and standards and requirements. So I think on the slide, you can see there was a fairly long list that Hervé's already had a look at. So if you think there are any things that we're missing, we would be very grateful just to have them pointed out so we can try to feed them into the future development of the work. So I'm seeing national frameworks, if they exist. I think that's a good one. I don't think we have thought about that yet, Hervé. I'm not entirely sure, but that might be something to take forward. FIDELIS network develops and works on harmonization and agreement on best practices. The matrix should continue to update and reflect this. Definitely, I think that's certainly something that we're hoping to do as well. Nestor seal, audit and certification of trustworthy digital repositories, ISO 16363. I don't know if they're in the thinking already, but I know certainly Hervé will be aware of all of these and is probably doing something on them. Domain-specific requirements, maybe Hervé, I don't know if you want to say anything about the domain-specific aspects at this point.
There's an active piece of work on EOS EDEN looking at disciplinary specific requirements around discipline, domain, and content types as well. So that's one of those pieces that we'll be integrating into this. But that does a little bit like national frameworks as well. That's another thing which, we're all we're all answerable to multiple different authorities with multiple different expectations, which is why modeling this trust context is going to be quite important for the future work, because that's not going to go away.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think core trust seal certainly has already been factored into the thinking for this, so I think that's there. I think there's a couple of points here definitely that we are aware of, that we need to look beyond Europe and the UK, and that we can't just focus on the Western. If we are looking for this to be more applicable beyond these contexts, that is certainly something that we'll be thinking about as well. So it's on our radar, but we'll see what we can do within the context of the project, I think is all we can say at this point. But we would definitely like to hear from people working in other contexts. If you think there are things that we should be aware of, we will certainly look at what we can do with the resources we have during the life of the project. And the clear definitions agreed by all. So I think TTRAM in some respects is hoping to do that in some respects, I think. But yes, that would also be useful. So I think I don't see any more. Oh, FAIR as an operational guideline. And I think definitely as the matrix becomes more granular, I think some of these aspects will come through. So that is definitely something we're thinking about as well. So I don't see anything else. I will move on to our last question in the poll. So again, this first couple of webinars we've had on TTRAM have been very much trying to share information about how the model has come to, the matrix has come into existence, and the sorts of things we're hoping to use the matrix for. But as we go forward, it is going to be more of a foundation that we use within Fidelis and try to map some of the training and the activities that we're doing. And one of the things we would like to know from you is, there are 30 elements in the matrix at the moment. Each of these potentially could be standalone bits of information that we could run training on. So would people be interested in having any of these hands-on training sessions on specific elements? Certainly, if the answer is yes, which it seems to be at the moment, this is something that we would certainly try to get some community involvement in trying to define which of the elements people want training on, and we can take that forward. So I think the numbers are going up for yes, so that's a good sign. Okay, well, I think we can stop there. The poll will be open for another, I think, 14 days. We're leaving it open for a little while, just in case people haven't had a chance to feed into it. You'll have a chance to continue for the next couple of weeks, but this will be helpful for us going forward. So I'll stop sharing there and say thank you very much for taking part in putting together the poll answers. Go back to the slides if I can.
And I think there's a question from Robin in the chat about, so she's asking, should we share things we think are best practices? Sounds like it. Yeah, I agree. Yes, please share. And I would add that in the FIDELIS project, next year we have work package 6 that we'll be working on, for example, on facilitating technical federation, and we will be looking at standards and so on, and also thinking of recommendations on best practices on that side, and that work will continue also. We will also be looking at policies and practices, and in year 3 of the project, we really have actually a task about recommended practices. So please share your practices, and we'd be really happy to hear all feedback and input into this work as well. So it's really something we are striving to have in the end of the project, a collection of recommended practices.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much for that, Marie, and for your question, Robin. Definitely, as Hervé said a few times, we want to try and make this as easy as possible for the community. So where we can share things that work and help people to avoid having to do work independently that's already been done, we'd love to be able to share that kind of stuff. So I just wanted to kind of wrap up with a few reminders of what will be happening in the next steps for TTRAM. As I mentioned, internally, we're looking at this as a way to help us frame some of the work we'll be doing around training. We also have some mentoring and open calls will be coming out next year. So TTRAM is something that we will hopefully be able to use to help structure these and make them a little bit more granular and useful. As Hervé mentioned, he'll be working over the summer with partners in the project to come up with a more stable version of the matrix based on the feedback. And there will be another virtual workshop in September to share that next iteration. If you do want to share some feedback, we would be very grateful for your views, thoughts, suggestions. So please do have a look at the link. It's in the shared notes as well. You can access the folder with all the documents. And there is a specific document there where you can add some feedback. You've got quite a bit of time. We've got until the 15th of August, so hopefully you'll find a little bit of time before you go on vacation to try and give us some feedback. We would be very grateful. All of that will feed into a report that will come out at the end of December, and that will be on the kind of current version of the matrix. It will be updated over the life of the project, but the first kind of more stable version will be released in December. And just a reminder for people who didn't actually get to the launch webinar for the Fidelis network, the recording is available online. So if you are interested, the links are in the shared notes as well. And final reminder, I guess, to complete the EDEN survey if you haven't already done so and you're interested. The deadline for that is the 30th of June. So please do take a look at that if you're interested. And with that, I think it's just to say thank you very much to all of the speakers for sharing the information on what's been going on so far. And thank you to everybody for taking part today and sharing your views on what we've shared with you. And we would love to hear more of your thoughts and comments going forward. So please do keep in touch with the website, and we'll try to let you know when the next webinar is coming up, when the date's finally been set. But in the meantime, please feel free to get in touch if you have anything, either using the public documents, or if you want to share things, get in touch with us through the channels here, and we'd be happy to hear from you. So thank you very much.